In our last video, we began to talk about how to list out the different common types of self-defense you're wanting to work out for yourself. Today we're going to cover how to start to design your self-defense plans around these techniques that you've listed. Stay tuned, we'll talk about it. Welcome to Shihan's Dojo. I'm Shihan Marty Husband, and I'm here today to help you build your skills and knowledge in the martial arts. We are continuing this next part from the series we started on the last video on how to set up your goals and listings for the self-defense you need to practice. If you're interested in that, go up there and check it. I'll leave a link up here at the top so you can go find it and start from there if you'd like. Otherwise, let's get started. Before we start setting up the different parameters and ideas that you want to use to examine your techniques, you have to understand a couple things. First, you have to know your own personality, what you're willing to do in a self-defense situation to defend yourself or just to survive any type of an attack. Many people don't realize how important it is to lay these plans down before they happen so you can better react or act in a situation when you need to. Also, you need to know your body type. What can your body do? If somebody is teaching you how to do a self-defense technique and you can't do it because your body type won't allow you, it's not an effective technique. You have to make sure these techniques are at least 90% effective for you. There's no 100% tactic that is ever going to be effective, but we'll discuss that in the next video. Now, in designing the type of tactic you'll use to defend yourself against these lists of different techniques that you have is to basically set up the objective. Remember, we prioritized and set up the severity of what that tactic can do, and we have to go off of that to make sure we can focus on how it can legitimately be done. You need to design your objective around that severity to know whether you're going to stop the opponent from coming in, control them somehow to keep them from hurting you, counter and attack them, or injure them to a point where they can't continue, or worse, having to finish it completely and possibly take someone's life. Don't ever recommend the last one, it causes a lot of problems. But if you have to, you have to. Now, in doing this, make your plans out so they can handle the different varying sizes of people. There's always going to be somebody a little smaller than you, same size as you, and possibly bigger than you. So you have to lay down that defense accordingly so you can understand what is needed to be able to complete your self-defense in there. This will help you later to find a way to set up different size of partners to see how effective these self-defense techniques are against that type of a technique. The same thing applies not only if you're doing the size, but how much stronger is your opponent than you are, or weaker, or the same. In a lot of instances, depending on the type of self-defense you're doing, if you guys have equal tactics, the bigger person will usually win if their experiences are about the same. Now, the whole point there is you might have to think about finding someone with a little more experience or less experience in those sizes to work with. Hopefully you've got a big school where you can try to work out with these people and figure out how to meet the criteria you're setting for yourself. When breaking it down too, you also need to make sure how you'll handle an aggressive situation where somebody's just coming in at you and you don't have time to think or understand. You just have to go with it and see if that technique you're planning on using works at that type of a situation. An important thing next to plan out when you're doing this is to sit down and think about how is this going to work at a kicking range or a punching range, grappling, or on the ground. And you're saying, well, the techniques won't matter. That's not true. If you think about things like strangulation or chokes, somebody can jump in from a kicking position, grab you by the neck, start choking. Same way with standing or grappling. But what's even more scary is if you're on the ground and they're on top of you choking you. How are you going to handle that? This would include trying to figure out how to handle them from the rear, the side. You just never know in a self-defense situation. That's why we said to list out the different angles or areas that they might attack you in. Just because you can be strangled from the front doesn't mean you can't be strangled from the rear or jumped from the side at a corner. Doesn't matter how you look at it, you have to weigh the situations, visualizing in your mind how it's going to work best for you. Once you've examined how they can be used against you, whether you personally or as an attack, weigh those out in that examination. The next portion of this would be to define how to defend yourself against this. Many people try to use techniques they're not as familiar with as they think they are. Remember to use techniques that you know you can use safely and efficiently. Don't try to do something that you don't know until you've practiced it enough on your own. Don't overthink a self-defense situation too. And what I mean by that is not about the angles, but don't overthink, well, I'm going to do this, then this, then this, then this, then this, and you go through a different list of things. Try to keep it simple. The best self-defense is quick and done. In your mind at this point, you have to ask yourself, does it work? If you have any doubts about that technique that you're using, make sure you go back and look at several secondary techniques that you can apply when you get to the physical phase of testing these. In using those simplistic techniques, you can then build your variations that you can use for that defense that you're trying to apply. Like when you were breaking it down the attacks, have others talk you through what they would do in a similar self-defense situation. If you've examined what they've told you, then try to implement that if you feel it's a logical self-defense. You don't have to recreate everything here. If something works, it works. The problem with a lot of self-defense is it doesn't work for everyone. So you have to make sure and test it yourself. That we'll look at it another time. I know there are a lot of people out there who hesitate to use other systems, but you'd be surprised what you can learn just by going over other systems and seeing how they handle situations similar or like that too. Make sure any partners you might use for this type of a self-defense have some feedback on what they think should be tried. It's good to get a couple heads together. 2 are better than 1 and 3 is better than 2. When you're done designing these, before you even start, you have to ask yourself a couple questions, and I call them the parameters of defense. First thing is, can I physically do the defense they're asking? Now think about this. When I say that, I simply mean, is it possible to handle this with a tall person, short person, aggressive person, same size person, so on and so forth? Because if your defense is to kick somebody in the head and they're taller than you and you can't kick that high, it's a useless self-defense technique for the size of the person you're against. You may have to sit back and rethink about it. So consider that before you go on after you've designed it. You also have to ask yourself next, is it simple and trainable? Now when I say that, you can train all day long doing 100 different techniques, but the repetitive nature of doing something simplistic and being able to repetitively do it to see if it works is very important. You have to ask yourself, is this simple enough and can I train it safely and properly? Then you have to break down, what does it take to train it? Does it need weapons? Does it need some sort of setups? Does it need something in that training? I can't tell you what it is because I don't know which one you're looking at. But say you need safety equipment or something like that to prevent injury to your partner or even yourself, depending on what you're trying to do. That's another consideration you have to take at this point. Sometimes you have to ask yourself, can this simple tactic work for all different types of variations of people, sizes, and types of attacks? It's something you have to weigh. Sometimes there's no way to fight somebody who's taller the same way you would anybody your size or smaller. The same exact thing can be said the other way. However, you have to determine in your mind how that would work against those attack variations. The next thing you have to understand is, does your technique flow from technique to technique? You might have to throw 1 or 2 techniques in order to defend yourself, but you have to ask yourself, is it going to flow properly where I can continue to move without any hesitation or jumpiness in my tactic where I might get caught up in the middle of it? Techniques have to flow. So make sure when you've examined it that you have defined it well enough to understand how it will work when it's continuing to its endpoint. The next thing you also have to do is, how have I covered the examination of defense? In other words, have I gone through and said, oh, I think this will work, or do I go through and study basically some biomechanics that might be applied into the defense I'm learning or want to teach myself? It's important that you really analyze this and not have somebody else think for you all the time. Another question you have to ask yourself, what are the pros and cons to this type of self-defense? Does it leave me in some kind of danger? Does it make me vulnerable at certain points during it? You have to look at your own body and how it's going to react during that time period to see the openings. There will always be some type of opening, but how are you preventing them from taking advantage of it? The last and probably the most important thing to remember, does this technique have a high probability of being able to work? Why do a technique if it's only going to work 20% of the time? You wouldn't want to do that because it's the other 80% of the time that's going to get you into trouble. So make sure you have a high probability of success when you're planning these techniques. And when you get to the point where you're actually practicing with a partner and it doesn't work and you see fallacies or problems with it, go back to the drawing board with that technique and redesign it, or make a video of yourself, share it between you and your partner and other people to see how you might be able to compensate if you still think that technique has a high probability. Always remember, it's just as much of an analysis when you're defining it and when you're putting it into action. I think the common fallacy is a lot of people will say, oh, this will work 100% of the time. I've yet to see a technique that is always 100% effective. There's always a counter, and we all know that, but we like to lie to ourselves to make us feel more confident. Try not to lie to yourself. You want the highest confidence in the technique you're using, but always remember you may have to go to a secondary techniques that you've planned already or examined and also implement them later in your training so that you can better have a plan B, C, and D. Remember too, don't always train just in your school uniforms or anything like that. Get in street clothes, get in shirtless, however you have to do it. Because in a real life situation, most of the time you're not going to be in your karate clothes or your training clothes. You'll be in something different. So I suggest when you're getting ready to set up practicing, also make that a primary list too on bringing in some old street clothes or whatever to practice in. That way you can get the feel of what it's really going to be like, because it's not uncommon for you to grab somebody's shirt and have it rip, or they grab yours and it rips. Whereas if you grab a karate gi, it doesn't usually rip, or a jiu-jitsu gi, they're pretty strong. That isn't true out on there with street clothing. So take that into consideration when you're planning your defense for it. Make sure you and your partners are both ready to implement this kind of a training exercise in order to give you more confidence and understanding of how realistic it can be in real street clothes. Now I hope you've enjoyed this second half of the video. We'll start the next one on how to work with your training partner, and we'll refer back to the tap system I talked about earlier. Now if you like the video, give it a thumbs up down there. Tell your friends about Shihan's Dojo so we can build it up. And if you have questions, anything, just go down there and leave a comment, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as possible if we can give you any answers. And we hope to see you again here on Shihan's Dojo.